Have you ever walked into your garden in the middle of summer and wondered where all the vegetables went because the plants are still standing there, but the harvest has almost stopped? The leaves may look green from a distance, but the flowers are falling off. The fruits stay small, and every afternoon the plants look tired again, even though you have been watering them. I used to think the answer was simple. Just give the garden more water and more fertilizer. But I learned the hard way that this can make the problem worse. During serious summer heat, the mistake is often not that you are doing too little, but that you are asking the wrong vegetables to keep working when the weather has already become too difficult for them. I remember one particularly hot summer when my tomatoes slowed down, the cucumbers struggled, and the lettuce was bitter almost before I could harvest it, while a few other plants in the same garden kept growing as if nothing unusual was happening. That got my attention. I started watching those plants more closely, and over the years I learned that some vegetables are simply better suited to heat than others. They can keep producing when ordinary cool weather crops begin to shut down, especially when you give them deep watering, simple mulch, and a little protection for their roots. The good news is that you do not need an expensive greenhouse or some complicated system to make this work. Many of the methods I use came from older gardeners who were not interested in buying another product every time the weather changed. They used what they had, they watched the soil, and they chose plants that matched the season. In this video, I want to show you which vegetables I trust when summer becomes brutally hot, how I choose varieties that have a better chance of continuing to produce, and the simple habits that help them stay productive without making the garden harder to manage. But there is one vegetable I now consider almost impossible to ignore during a serious heat wave, and the reason it keeps producing has nothing to do with giving it more fertilizer. The first thing I learned about growing vegetables through a hot July is that the biggest mistake is often not forgetting to water, but watering in the wrong way. I used to stand with a hose and give the garden a quick drink whenever the leaves looked tired, and for a little while everything seemed better. But by the next afternoon, the same plants were struggling again. The surface of the soil looked wet while the deeper roots were still dry, and that uneven moisture was quietly weakening the plants when they needed strength the most. Older gardeners taught me to stop watching the leaves alone and start paying attention to the soil. Give the roots a deeper drink and let that moisture move down where the roots can actually use it. Then cover the ground with something simple such as dry leaves, straw, or other clean garden material you already have. That layer does not look like much, but it slows evaporation and keeps the root area from heating and drying so quickly. It can also save you from standing outside with a hose every few hours during a heat wave. There is another mistake I see often, and I made it myself for years. When a vegetable slows down during extreme heat, people assume it needs more fertilizer. I used to think the same way. If the plant was not growing, I thought I should feed it more. But when the real problem is heat and uneven moisture, extra feeding is not the first thing I want to reach for. I protect the roots first and let the plant recover. This becomes especially important when choosing vegetables for the hottest part of the year, because heat tolerance does not mean a plant can live without water. Okra is a good example. It can actually enter a strong period of growth when summer becomes very hot, but it still needs steady moisture and good drainage. Yard-long beans can keep producing pods when common beans begin slowing down, and hot pepper varieties can continue growing when many cooler season vegetables have already given up. I also pay close attention to what I harvest and when I harvest it. With okra, I pick young pods regularly because leaving too many mature pods on the plant can slow the production of new flowers. With beans, I do the same and avoid letting old pods hang there for too long. That small habit costs nothing, takes only a few minutes, and can keep a heat-loving plant working longer. But there is one group of vegetables that becomes especially interesting when the heat arrives because they do not merely tolerate summer. They seem to use the warmth to their advantage, and that is where I would start if I were rebuilding my garden today. One thing I want you to understand before we start choosing these vegetables is that I do not look for a plant that simply survives the heat. I look for one that can still give me something useful while the heat is here. There is a big difference between a vegetable that stays alive and a vegetable that keeps making leaves, flowers, or fruit. I learned this after many summers of planting the same things every year and expecting them to behave the same way no matter what the weather did. Some vegetables simply slow down when the temperature stays high for days. Others are much more comfortable in those conditions. Okra is one of the first plants I think about because serious summer heat can actually support its flowering and pod production when the roots have enough moisture. Its deeper root system gives it an advantage because it can reach moisture farther below the surface instead of depending entirely on the thin layer of soil that dries out first. I like to give it loose soil mixed with compost and enough room for the roots to develop. Then I water deeply rather than giving it a little drink every evening. Yard-long beans are another favorite of mine because they seem to wake up when July really arrives. They climb quickly, move air through their leaves, and can continue producing pods when ordinary beans begin slowing down. A simple trellis made from old sticks or wire is enough. You do not need a special garden structure if you have something sturdy around the house. Then there are hot peppers, and this is where many gardeners make a mistake because they put all peppers into the same category. Some types handle hot conditions much better than others, especially varieties that come from warm growing regions. The important part is keeping the soil evenly moist without leaving the roots sitting in water. I also like New Zealand spinach when ordinary spinach has already bolted because it gives me another way to keep fresh greens coming during the hottest months. It behaves differently from traditional spinach and can continue producing when cool weather greens have already become bitter or stopped growing. But choosing the right vegetable is only half of this old lesson. Even the toughest heat-loving plant can struggle if its roots are sitting in bare soil that becomes dry and hot every afternoon. That is why the next thing I want to show you is not another vegetable at all. It is a simple method that can make the same plant perform very differently during a heat wave, and it costs almost nothing. The simple method I want you to try is protecting the soil before you start trying to save the plant. This is something I learned from older gardeners who did not have automatic irrigation systems or expensive products sitting in the shed. They understood that if the ground around a vegetable stays cooler and holds moisture longer, the plant has a much easier job during hot weather. I start with mulch, and I use whatever clean material I already have. Dry leaves work well. Straw works well. Even chopped garden material can be useful if it is clean and suitable for the bed. I spread it around the plants while leaving a little open space around the main stem so the stem is not sitting against constantly wet material. The difference can be surprisingly large. Without mulch, the sun hits the soil directly and moisture disappears quickly. With mulch, the soil stays more stable, and the roots have a better chance of finding moisture when the afternoon heat arrives. The second part is how I water. I do not want to stand there every evening and give the garden a shallow sprinkle. I would rather water deeply and give the roots a reason to grow downward. For vegetables that are expected to keep producing through heat, this matters because a deeper root system has access to moisture that disappears much faster near the surface. With okra, for example, I want the soil to stay reasonably moist, but never permanently soaked. Good drainage still matters even for a heat-loving crop. There is another little habit that costs nothing and can make a real difference. I check the soil with my hand before watering instead of following a calendar. If the soil is still moist below the surface, I wait. If it is dry where the active roots are working, I water deeply. This sounds almost too simple, but it prevents the cycle of letting plants become severely dry and then flooding them afterward. I also try to harvest heat-loving vegetables regularly. With okra, I do not let large, tough pods remain on the plant because frequent harvesting encourages continued production. The same basic idea applies to yard-long beans. Keep picking the young pods and the plant has a reason to keep producing, instead of putting all its effort into mature pods and seeds. But there is one more old habit that I think is even more important when the weather becomes extreme, because it changes which plants you choose in the first place. Instead of asking which vegetable gives the biggest harvest in perfect weather, I ask which vegetable still gives me something when the weather is far from perfect. And that question leads us to the vegetables I rely on when the thermometer keeps climbing. What I pay even more attention to now is the difference between choosing a heat-tolerant vegetable and choosing the right place for it. A plant can be perfectly suited to hot weather and still struggle if its roots are trapped in dry, compacted soil, or if the afternoon sun hits a container from every direction. I learned this with peppers because I once had two plants of the same type growing only a few steps apart. One stayed productive while the other dropped flowers and looked tired every afternoon. I kept thinking the weaker plant needed more water, but when I finally checked the soil properly, I found that the root area was drying much faster than I realized. That was the point when I stopped treating every heat problem as a watering problem. Sometimes the better answer is to change the conditions around the roots. I now choose a loose soil that can hold moisture without staying soaked, and I mix in compost when the soil needs more life and structure. With peppers and eggplants, I also give the plants enough room for their roots because a strong root system makes the whole plant more dependable when the weather turns difficult. The same idea works with climbing vegetables. Yard-long beans and other heat-tolerant pole beans benefit from a sturdy support because keeping the vines off the ground improves air movement and gives the plant room to grow instead of letting everything become a tangled mass near the hot soil. There's also a vegetable I keep coming back to when I want fresh greens in the middle of summer. New Zealand spinach is useful because ordinary spinach often bolts when the weather becomes hot, while this plant can continue producing tender leaves through much warmer conditions. And this is where variety selection becomes important. I do not simply walk into a garden center and choose the first packet with a familiar name. I look for descriptions that mention heat tolerance or warm season production, and I think about what that vegetable is naturally good at. Cowpeas are another example because they were developed in climates where heat and dry conditions are normal, and many varieties can continue flowering when other beans begin to struggle. Once you start thinking this way, the garden becomes much easier to manage because you are no longer fighting the season. You are choosing plants that fit it. But even the toughest vegetable has a limit, and there is one simple mistake with shade that can quietly ruin an otherwise good summer crop. Most gardeners notice it only after the leaves begin showing damage, and by then the heat has already taken its toll. There was a summer when I finally understood why some vegetables in my garden kept producing, while others seemed to shut down every afternoon. I had been watching the wrong thing. I was looking at the plants instead of looking at what the heat was doing to the space around them. Once I started giving the hottest part of the day a little protection, the difference was easy to see. I did not build anything complicated. I used thin pieces of bamboo and some old light-colored cotton sheets that were already sitting around the house. I made simple frames and placed the cloth above the plants so the strongest afternoon sun was softened without putting the vegetables into deep shade. That small change helped tomatoes continue setting fruit and kept cucumbers and other plants from looking exhausted by late afternoon. This is one of those old methods that sounds almost too simple until you see the plants after several days of extreme heat. The important thing is not to cover everything all day. The goal is to reduce the hardest part of the heat when the sun is strongest. I still want the plants to receive plenty of light, but I do not need to prove anything to the sun by leaving them completely exposed. There is another small thing I began doing at the same time, and it helped more than I expected. I put shallow dishes of water around the garden and placed a few small stones inside so bees and other helpful insects could land safely. During hot weather, I noticed more pollinators visiting the flowers, and that matters because good pollination means more beans, more cucumbers, more squash, and more peppers forming, instead of flowers simply falling away. I also stopped ignoring the thin crust that forms on uncovered soil after repeated watering. Every few days I gently loosen only the very top layer without digging deeply enough to disturb the roots. An old gardener taught me this years ago, and it became one of those habits that takes almost no time but keeps water moving into the soil instead of running across the surface. When these simple things are combined with heat-tolerant vegetables, deep watering, and mulch, the garden starts behaving differently. You spend less time trying to rescue plants and more time harvesting from them. But there is still one mistake that can undo all of this work, and it happens because gardeners become too helpful when the weather gets difficult. I made this mistake myself, and it cost me an entire wave of summer vegetables before I understood what was happening. The mistake I finally learned to avoid is trying to force every vegetable to produce through every kind of weather. Have you ever walked into your garden in the middle of summer and wondered where all the vegetables went because the plants are still standing there when the heat arrives? That does not mean giving up on tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, or other familiar crops. It simply means having a second group ready for the hardest part of summer. In my garden, I like to keep a few dependable heat-loving vegetables growing together so that one crop can slow down while another continues giving us something to bring into the kitchen. Okra is one of those plants because it can keep flowering and producing pods when the days become very hot, as long as the soil has enough moisture and drains properly. Yard-long beans are another because their long vines can keep producing during sustained warm weather when ordinary beans begin to struggle. I also keep New Zealand spinach in mind because it can provide fresh leaves during the months when ordinary spinach has already bolted. Hot peppers and eggplant are useful choices too, because many varieties are comfortable with warm soil and strong summer sunlight when they are given enough root space and consistent moisture. But the real lesson is not that one magic vegetable will solve everything. The lesson is that you can build a garden that works with the weather instead of constantly fighting it. Choose plants that naturally handle heat. Give them loose soil. Water deeply when they need it. Keep the soil covered with simple mulch. Use light afternoon shade when the sun becomes too intense. Harvest regularly so the plant keeps making new food instead of putting all its energy into old fruit and mature seed. These are small things, and most of them cost almost nothing. An old gardener once told me that you should never make the garden harder than it needs to be, and I understand that better now than I did when I was younger. You do not need to win a battle against summer. You only need to choose wisely and make a few simple changes before the worst heat arrives. Once you do that, July and August stop feeling like the end of the garden and start feeling like another harvest season. And next time, I want to show you another group of vegetables that many people overlook because they are waiting for cooler weather, even though they can give you a fresh harvest when most gardens are beginning to slow down.